and fascinating details behind royal families and dynasties from around the world. Join us as we uncover the history, culture, and curiosities that connect crowns across continents.
Let's begin with a challenge. Name the most successful royal dynasty in 19th century Europe. Take a moment. Think about it seriously. Most people would say the Habsburgs, centuries of accumulated power, an empire stretching from Spain to Hungary, a name synonymous with European royalty for half a millennium. A reasonable answer. Others might say the Romanovs, the rulers of the largest country on earth, presiding over a court of legendary extravagance, commanding armies that had defeated Napoleon himself. Also reasonable. Some would choose the Bourbons, the family that produced kings of France, Spain, and Naples, whose branches spread across southern Europe like roots of an ancient tree. All reasonable answers, all wrong. Because the most successful royal family of the 19th century was a dynasty so obscure that most people today have never heard of it. A family from a territory so small it barely registered on the map of Europe. A name so complicated that most people, encountering it for the first time, assume it must be a misprint. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. By the early 20th century, descendants of this family sat on thrones across the continent, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Bulgaria, and through marriage connections radiating outward in every direction, their bloodline had reached into virtually every remaining royal house in Europe. They didn't conquer a single territory. They never won a famous battle. They never commanded the largest army or controlled the most land. And yet, somehow, Europe invited them in. The story of how they managed that is one of the most remarkable and least told stories in modern history. To understand how the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha achieved what it did, you first need to understand the world it was operating in. Before 1871, before Bismarck unified Germany into a single nation-state, Central Europe looked nothing like it does today. Where Germany now stands, there was instead a bewildering patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, duchies, free cities, ecclesiastical territories, and political entities so small they barely had names that outsiders could pronounce. Some of these states were genuinely powerful. Prussia had an army that commanded respect. Austria had an empire that commanded fear. And then there were the others, the minor houses, the small duchies whose rulers dressed in the same uniforms, attended the same courts, and observed the same dynastic rituals as their grander neighbors, who wielded influence measured in tens of thousands of subjects rather than millions. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was one of these, a small duchy in what is now the German state of Thuringia. Pleasant enough countryside, no significant military power, no great natural resources, nothing that would make a strategist look at it and see the foundation of a continental dynasty. But here is what the House of Saxe-Coburg understood that larger, more powerful families often missed. In the game of dynastic marriage, being a great power was sometimes a disadvantage. When a Habsburg prince married into another royal house, it raised questions. What does Austria want? What will it demand in return? What does this marriage mean for the balance of power? Major dynasties brought major complications. Their weddings were geopolitical events that other countries watched with anxiety. A prince from Saxe-Coburg raised none of these questions. He was educated, well-connected, impeccably aristocratic, and completely non-threatening. He brought prestige without baggage, legitimacy without fear, connection without obligation. In a Europe that was simultaneously obsessed with dynastic propriety and deeply anxious about political dominance, that combination was extraordinarily valuable. And the family recognized this, and they built an entire strategy around it. Behind every great dynastic strategy, there is usually a single mind that shapes it. For the Habsburgs, it was Maximilian I in the late 15th century. For the Saxe-Coburgs, the architect was Duke Ernest I, and the system he created was a less formal plan than a deeply embedded family culture. Ernest understood that his dynasty's only real asset was its children. And so those children were treated, from the earliest age, as the dynasty's primary investment. The education they received was remarkable for the era. Languages, French, English, the languages of the courts where they might one day appear, music, which opened social doors, history and politics, because a prince who could converse intelligently with statesmen was worth more than one who could merely ride and hunt. And above all, manners, the kind of courtly grace that made people feel comfortable, respected, and, crucially, unthreatened. The Saxe-Coburg princes and princesses were trained, in essence, to be the ideal guests at every court in Europe. Charming enough to be welcome, accomplished enough to be impressive, pedigreed enough to satisfy dynastic requirements, but never so powerful that their presence felt like a threat. And then the family developed something even more valuable than education, a network. Duke Ernest I cultivated relationships with courts across the continent with a patience and consistency that slowly built a reputation. When a royal family needed a suitable match, the name Saxe-Coburg began appearing on the list. When a newly established state needed a king who would be acceptable to multiple competing powers, Saxe-Coburg offered candidates who offended nobody. It was, in modern terms, the most successful talent agency in European history. Except the talent was princes, the clients were thrones, and the contracts were signed at wedding altars. The first great placement came in 1831. Belgium had just been born. The country had broken away from the Netherlands in a revolution the previous year, and now it needed a king. Not just any king, one who could satisfy the competing demands of its Catholic population, its liberal constitution, its powerful French neighbor, its cautious British patron, and the broader European concert of powers that insisted on stability above all else. Finding a single candidate acceptable to all of these interests simultaneously seemed nearly impossible. The choice fell on Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. He was a widower. His first wife, Princess Charlotte of Britain, had died tragically young, which gave him existing connections to the British royal family. He was Protestant, which satisfied certain diplomatic requirements while being flexible enough in his religious politics to govern a Catholic country. He was experienced, having served in the Russian army and navigated European courts for years. And he was from Saxe-Coburg, which meant he threatened nobody. Leopold accepted. He became Leopold I of Belgium, and he ruled with such consistent intelligence and diplomatic skill that he transformed what might have been a failed experiment in new statehood into one of Europe's most stable constitutional monarchies. But Leopold's greater contribution to his dynasty was not what he did as king. It was who he introduced to each other. He was the uncle who brought his niece Victoria together with his nephew Albert, the matchmaker at the center of the most consequential royal marriage of the 19th century. Because when Victoria became Queen of the United Kingdom in 1837, 18 years old, suddenly the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, the question of whom she would marry was not merely personal. It was a question that the entire world was watching. She married Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840. Close your eyes and let the implications of that settle. The Queen of the United Kingdom, the head of an empire that, at its peak, would cover a quarter of the Earth's land surface, married to a prince from a small German duchy that most Europeans couldn't locate on a map, and through their 9 children, married into royal families across the continent, the bloodline of that small German duchy flowed into the veins of European royalty for generations to come. By the early 20th century, if you had drawn a map of Europe's royal families and traced the genetic and dynastic connections between them, the result would have looked less like a political diagram and more like a spider's web. And at the center of that web, again and again, you would find Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Portugal had acquired a branch of the dynasty in 1853 when Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg married Queen Maria II and founded the House of Saxe-Coburg. Bulgaria, newly independent from the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century and in need of a monarch acceptable to the great powers, chose Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha as its first prince in 1887. Belgium remained firmly under Leopold's descendants, and Britain's royal family carried the Saxe-Coburg name openly until 1917. Each placement had followed the same pattern. A new throne, or an unstable one, needed someone who combined dynastic legitimacy with political neutrality. Saxe-Coburg had that candidate ready. The family had spent decades building exactly the reputation, exactly the network, exactly the type of prince or princess that these moments required. It was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the long, patient execution of a strategy that most dynasties were too proud, too powerful, or too short-sighted to pursue. Larger families dismissed the Saxe-Coburgs as minor. They were, in a sense, correct. But minor families have one advantage that great powers rarely do. Nobody fears them. And in the delicate arithmetic of 19th century European diplomacy, being feared was often the greatest obstacle to influence. And then came 1914, and with it, the crisis that threatened to undo everything the family had built. War between Britain and Germany created an impossible situation for the British royal family. They were, officially, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German name, in a country at war with Germany, fighting a conflict that was killing British soldiers by the hundreds of thousands on the Western Front. The newspapers began to notice. Questions were asked in public that had been previously only whispered. How could the royal family ask for sacrifice from British subjects while carrying a German name? The Kaiser himself, a grandson of Victoria, a blood relative of King George V, was portrayed in British propaganda as the embodiment of everything the war was being fought against. George V understood the danger with clarity. The monarchy had survived centuries by remaining connected to national identity. Now that identity was being challenged at the deepest level. Every day the German name remained, it was a vulnerability, a gift to critics, a symbol of distance between the crown and the people being asked to die for it. In July 1917, the king issued a royal proclamation. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha ceased to exist. In its place, the House of Windsor, named for Windsor Castle, that most English of royal residences, its round tower rising above the Thames in a landscape that looked like the illustration on a postcard of Britain. The Kaiser, when he heard the news, reportedly made a joke. He said he looked forward to attending a performance of Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg Gotha. It was funny. It was also completely irrelevant, because the rebrand worked. Within a generation, Windsor was the name everyone knew. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha retreated into the footnotes of history, surfacing only in academic texts and genealogical charts. The German origins of Britain's royal family became, for most people, an obscure historical curiosity rather than a live political issue. Think about what that represents. A family that had spent a century building its identity across Europe had, when circumstances demanded it, shed that identity and constructed a new one, without losing the throne, without losing the public trust, without losing continuity. It was adaptation at its most deliberate, a conscious decision to prioritize survival over history. The story of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha is not, at its core, a story about a German duchy. It's a story about a particular kind of intelligence, the intelligence of positioning, of understanding what the moment requires and having the foresight to prepare for it years, sometimes decades in advance. Other dynasties had more land, more soldiers, more gold, more of everything that looked like power in the traditional sense. Saxe-Coburg had something different. They had the right reputation at the right moment. They had children educated to be exactly what unstable thrones needed. They had a network built patiently across decades that meant when opportunity arrived, there was always a Saxe-Coburg name on the list. And when the world changed, when the name itself became a liability rather than an asset, they changed the name. No dynasty in European history more perfectly illustrates the difference between power and influence. Power is what you hold directly, by force or by law. Influence is what others extend to you because they find you useful, trustworthy, or both. The great powers of 19th century Europe held power. Saxe-Coburg accumulated influence. And when the catastrophes of the 20th century destroyed so many of those great powers, the Romanovs executed, the Habsburgs deposed, the German imperial house abolished, the family that had quietly inserted itself into the fabric of European royalty through patience and strategy was still there. Wearing a different name, sitting on thrones they had never conquered, ruling countries that had chosen them freely, in a continent that had tried repeatedly to tear itself apart. The small duchy that nobody feared had outlasted the empires that everyone respected. History, as it turns out, has a sense of humor.